The chandeliers trembled as Hermann Göring raised his hand, a gloved finger stabbing the air like a bayonet. September 1939, Berlin was flush with triumph. Poland had fallen in weeks, and the Reich believed itself invincible. In the marble hall of the Air Ministry, Luftwaffe officers crowded close, their tunics pressed, medals gleaming, boots echoing on polished stone. Göring's voice carried with theatrical weight. "No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Göring. You may call me Meyer." The room erupted in laughter. To the officers of the Luftwaffe, the statement seemed less boast than simple fact. Their flak towers, concrete giants armed with 128mm guns, already loomed over Berlin and Hamburg. Their fighter wings flew the Messerschmitt Bf-109, the sharpest blade in Europe, capable of 350 miles per hour in level flight. Göring's men had blooded themselves in Spain and outclassed Polish defenders in weeks. Why should they fear bombers that America barely had in prototype form? The mockery spread beyond the officer corps. Berliners, always quick with a joke, christened the wailing sirens of air raid drills Meyer's trumpets. Housewives smiled at the gallows humor. Shopkeepers reassured themselves that the Reich's capital was untouchable. No one believed foreign bombers could cross German skies and return alive. The laughter hardened into certainty. The Luftwaffe was the strongest air force the world had ever seen. On paper, their confidence had foundation. In 1939, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the aircraft destined to become America's hammer, was still limited to a combat radius of around 850 miles with a full bomb load. Its maximum range, stripped for ferry flights, stretched just shy of 1,850 miles. Hardly enough to leap the Atlantic or strike deep into Europe. Germany's intelligence officers reported these figures faithfully, and Göring dismissed the threat with a wave of his hand. Too heavy, too expensive, too few. The Reich believed in craftsmanship, in hand-assembled machines built with exacting care. It did not understand the power of interchangeable parts, of assembly lines that ran day and night. Across the ocean, unnoticed in that marble hall, something different was taking shape. In Detroit, the hum of machinery already filled factories converting from automobiles to engines. In Seattle, riveters practiced on aluminum skins that would soon cover fleets of fortresses. American engineers weren't trying to perfect a handful of elite machines. They were designing production itself as a weapon. A single factory in Michigan would soon outproduce entire German aircraft sectors combined. Göring's boast was not just arrogance, it was ignorance of a system his rigid ideology could never replicate. That evening in Berlin, the officers toasted their commander. The Reichsmarschall basked in their admiration, his bulk spilling against his uniform, his words echoing like prophecy. Yet outside, storm clouds gathered over Europe. Britain was not finished. America was not asleep. And industry, the quiet giant Göring discounted, was about to turn war into arithmetic. The irony is sharp in hindsight. Within 4 years, contrails would stretch across Berlin's skies, thousands of engines droning in unison. Bomb bays would open with mechanical precision, releasing more destructive tonnage in a single raid than Germany's entire air force could deliver in a month. The city that mocked Meyer's trumpets would learn their sound was no joke, but the grim overture to firestorms. That night in 1939, laughter filled the hall. Officers clapped each other's backs, convinced of supremacy. Göring smiled, certain of his prophecy. Yet already, in Detroit, a foreman was checking his watch as a shift began, and in Seattle, a young woman steadied her rivet gun for the first time. The Reich believed tradition would outfight abundance. It could not imagine what would happen when a free people built bombers the way they built cars. The morning whistle at Willow Run cut through the Michigan frost like a clarion call. Workers streamed toward the mile-long plant, their breath fogging in the air, lunch pails clanking at their sides. Inside, the cavernous hall smelled of oil, hot steel, and fresh paint. Rivet guns barked in rhythm, echoing like machine gun fire. A fuselage rested on the line, its aluminum skin gleaming under the arc lamps, waiting for wings, engines, and a bomb bay. By the end of the shift, it would roll forward one station, replaced immediately by the next. At full tempo, the plant produced one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. That number seemed impossible to outsiders, but it was the arithmetic of democracy. Henry Ford had taken the principles of automobile production, conveyor belts, standardized jigs, interchangeable parts, and applied them to strategic bombing. Before Willow Run, aircraft had been crafted like furniture, slow, meticulous, dependent on skilled hands. Now they were stamped, riveted, and assembled in a flow that turned farm boys and housewives into aircraft builders overnight. The Liberator itself looked ungainly compared to the more celebrated B-17. Its slab sides and twin tail gave it the profile of a flying boxcar. But beneath its skin lay efficiency. 4 Pratt & Whitney R1 830 engines that could push the bomber nearly 300 miles per hour, a range of about 1,540 miles with a standard load, and the ability to haul up to 8,000 pounds of bombs on shorter runs. For commanders planning long-range strikes, it was a workhorse. For the German High Command, it became a nightmare once they realized the scale of its production. Willow Run was not alone. Across the nation, factories in Seattle, Fort Worth, Tulsa, and San Diego echoed with the same industrial music. In 1944 alone, America produced 96,318 aircraft of all types. By war's end, more than 300,000 had been built, more planes than the Axis powers combined could put into the sky. Germany had mocked American bombers as too few, too fragile. Yet Ford's plant alone outproduced entire Luftwaffe sectors. The workforce at Willow Run told its own story of democratic power. Women with kerchiefs tied over their hair leaned into rivet guns. African Americans who had fled southern sharecropping found union wages at the plant. Farmers left their fields to build machines that would fly over Berlin. They worked not under compulsion, but with belief that their labor was part of something greater. Paychecks fed families, but pride fed production. Each completed fuselage was a promise to men already in combat. You will not fight alone. You will not run out. We will keep sending steel and wings until tyranny breaks. The contrast with Germany was stark. In the Reich, workers were conscripted, forced into long hours under threat of punishment. Skilled craftsmen labored in small batches, tools passed by hand, production slowed by bureaucracy and sabotage. In America, abundance was the rule. Raw materials flowed freely from mines and mills, transported on Liberty ships that themselves were built in weeks. The German assumption that the United States lacked seriousness was shattered by numbers alone. Rivet by rivet, bomber by bomber, Willow Run wrote the answer to Göring's boast. While he sneered at dollar chasers, American industry turned dollars into bomb bays and wages into wings. Every 63 minutes, another Liberator joined the arsenal. In a single month of 1944, the plant produced 428 heavy bombers. Germany, by comparison, struggled to build a fraction of that number across all its factories. At the end of a shift, workers filed out into the night, their clothes dusted with aluminum shavings. Some would take buses back to Detroit, others walk across frozen fields to farmhouses. They left behind another bomber nearly ready for flight. Democracy was building an air force faster than the Reich could comprehend. And across the Atlantic, Berlin still slept under the illusion that sirens were a joke, that Göring's boast held weight. The cornfields of Michigan were proving otherwise. November 1943, Berlin. The air carried a brittle chill, the kind that made coal smoke linger low over the streets. Children pulled sleds across the dusting of snow in the Tiergarten, weaving past statues wrapped in sandbags like mummies. Shop windows were darkened with tape against shattering glass, but life clung to its routines. Families queued with ration cards in hand, waiting for cabbage and potatoes. The lucky might find sausage, though thinner and grayer than in peacetime. In Charlottenburg, Anna Weber, a nurse with tired eyes, finished a 12-hour shift tending to soldiers returned from the Eastern Front. She carried bread crusts home in her satchel, saving one for her neighbor's son. The capital still believed itself safe. Raids had come before, but they were scattered, light enough to be dismissed. The Reich had poured concrete into massive flak towers, Tiergarten, Humboldthain, Friedrichshain, armed with 128mm guns that could reach to 40,000 feet. Smaller 20mm and 37mm guns dotted rooftops, their barrels pointed skyward in arrogant defiance. Propaganda posters promised invincibility. Berliners reassured themselves that their city was too distant, too well defended, too vital to Hitler to ever fall victim to catastrophe. The sirens, tested in drills, had become a macabre joke. People nicknamed them Meyer's trumpets, a biting reference to Göring's 1939 boast that no bomber would touch the Ruhr. When the wailing began at night, Berliners would roll their eyes, gather their belongings, and descend dutifully into shelters. Few stayed awake wondering whether the Americans, those dollar chasers, could ever mount a serious threat. The Luftwaffe was still feared, its aces with their victory tallies, its fighters sleek and fast. The idea of American bombers roaring over Berlin in daylight seemed absurd. Yet the signs were already there for those willing to see them. Supplies grew scarce, soap was rationed, coal shipments faltered. Anna noticed the hospital's stores of bandages thinning, the quality of medicines degrading. Her patients whispered of Allied advances in Italy, of defeats on the Eastern Front. Still, she kept her doubts quiet. It was safer that way. In a totalitarian state, optimism was demanded, not optional. On the evening of the 22nd of November, Anna walked home through streets shrouded in early winter darkness. She saw men in gray overcoats with armbands herding civilians into shelters for inspection drills. She heard laughter from a cafe where customers sipped ersatz coffee. Above, the stars glittered, sharp and cold, undisturbed. Berlin seemed secure in its illusions. That night, Anna prepared for bed fully clothed, a habit she had learned after too many siren interruptions. She placed a blanket near the door, set her shoes within reach. Her neighbor tapped on the wall, a simple code they used to signal readiness in case the sirens wailed. When she closed her eyes, she heard distant engines in her memory, the echo of smaller raids. She thought of her patients, the burned and broken men from the Eastern Front, and wondered whether the capital would ever truly share their suffering. The answer came just before midnight. The wail rose, long and mournful, filling the city's air with a sound once laughed at but now unmistakably grim. Meyer's trumpets sang, and Berliners, Anna among them, stirred awake, clutching bags, heading for the shelters. Few could know that this night would be unlike the others. In England, 764 bombers were already in the air, crossing the North Sea under the cover of moonlight. Their bomb bays were loaded not just with explosives, but with history's verdict on arrogance. For Anna, descending into the basement, the sound of the siren carried no humor. It was the sound of something breaking, of certainty itself cracking under the weight of approaching engines. The first low rumble reached Berlin just before midnight, a vibration that crept up through cellar walls and rattled crockery in darkened kitchens. At first, it sounded like thunder, distant and harmless. Then the sirens wailed again, louder, urgent, a chorus across the city. Anna Weber tightened her coat around her shoulders and pressed back against the cool concrete wall of the basement shelter. Children whimpered as the ground itself seemed to tremble. Overhead, 764 RAF bombers bore down on Berlin. The force was immense: 469 Lancasters, 234 Halifaxes, 50 Sterlings, 11 Mosquitoes. Engines droned in synchronized waves, a mechanical hum that carried across the night sky like an approaching tide. In their bomb bays waited 2,300 tons of high explosives and incendiaries, enough to shatter the illusion of Berlin's safety. The first bombs fell on Charlottenburg. Explosions lit the night in violent orange flashes. glass windows imploding across blocks. Then came the incendiaries, thousands of them. Small magnesium devices that clattered across rooftops and stairwells, igniting wherever they landed. The November air was dry, the winds restless. Fire took hold instantly, spreading from building to building, as if the city itself had become kindling. Anna covered her ears as the shelter shook. The roar was unearthly, a mixture of detonation, collapsing masonry, and the sucking wind of flames. Firestorms created their own weather. Air was drawn inward with hurricane force, feeding the inferno. People who stepped outside were hurled forward, oxygen ripped from their lungs. Streets vanished in a sea of fire. Above the chaos, the crews of Bomber Command watched the glow spread beneath them. Some reported seeing the flames from 100 miles away as they turned for home. The Lancaster, with its bomb bay able to carry up to 14,000 pounds, was the workhorse of this destruction. It could deliver more in one sortie than many entire Luftwaffe groups combined. For RAF planners, this was the opening of the Battle of Berlin, a campaign meant to break the Reich's morale by fire. By dawn, the toll was clear. 1,757 Berliners lay dead. 175,000 more were homeless, their possessions reduced to ash. The Tiergarten itself burned, trees crackling like torches. The Berlin Zoo lost animals in flames, elephants trumpeted in terror before enclosures collapsed, exotic birds scattered into smoke. For civilians like Anna, the sights and smells were unforgettable. Acrid rubber, scorched wood, and something worse that clung to the air. The city had been raided before, but never like this. The Reich's heart had suffered in a single night what it once thought impossible. The myth of invulnerability, fed by Göring's laughter and Berliners' mockery of Meyer's trumpets, was gone. In the smoldering morning light, Anna emerged from the shelter. Streets were lined with refugees carrying blankets, children clutching dolls blackened by soot. Fire crews still battled smoldering blocks, their hoses hissing uselessly against walls of flame. In some quarters, entire rows of housing had vanished, nothing left but skeletal chimneys. She saw a tram frozen on its tracks, windows blown out, the metal body warped by heat. And yet the war would not pause. Berlin's civilians swept glass from windowsills, carried buckets of water to neighbors, salvaged what they could. But beneath the gestures of resilience was a growing fear. If this could happen once, it could happen again. And worse, what if daylight came with even greater destruction? For the RAF, the night proved the doctrine of mass bombing could reach the Reich's core. For Berliners, it was the night when confidence collapsed into dread. The sirens that had once been mocked as Meyer's trumpets were now heard for what they were, the overture to hell. The engines began their thunder before dawn on the 6th of March, 1944. In the misty English morning, crews of the 8th Air Force strapped into their flying fortresses and liberators. Captain James "Red" McCloskey of the 100th Bomb Group tugged at his oxygen mask, checked the gauges, and slapped the fuselage wall. "Let's give the bastards something to think about," he told his crew over the interphone. Outside, ground crews pulled chocks and waved. Nearly 700 American heavy bombers rose from airfields across East Anglia, joined by hundreds of long-range escorts. Their destination was written on every man's orders: Berlin. The Germans had mocked the idea. For years, they believed no daylight raid could penetrate their defenses and survive. But now silver formations stretched horizon to horizon, B-17s bristling with 13.50 caliber machine guns each, B-24s lumbering with their boxy hulls, all droning eastward. Above and behind flew the new shadow, the P-51 Mustang. With drop tanks, it could range to Berlin and back, climbing to 40,000 feet and cruising at 440 miles per hour. For the first time, single-engine fighters would escort the bombers all the way. Göring's boast that no bomber would touch the Ruhr was about to be tested over the Reich's capital. As the Armada crossed into Germany, flak batteries roared awake, Black puffs erupted around the formations, each an 88mm shell bursting at altitude, fragments slicing through aluminum. The steady thunk-thunk of concussions shook McCloskey's fortress. Shrapnel ripped across the nose, cracking plexiglass. The navigator swore and ducked, charts fluttering like startled birds. Still, the formation pressed on, holding tight boxes to concentrate defensive fire. Then came the fighters, BF-109S and FW-190S from Jägerschwader 11 and 54 screamed in head-on, spitting 20mm cannon fire. McCloskey's gunners opened up, the waist guns hammering until barrels smoked. He saw a fortress ahead take a direct hit, wings shearing off, tumbling down with parachutes blooming behind. Another exploded in a flash of fuel, gone in an instant. The sky was a brutal ledger, bombers falling, fighters trailing smoke, parachutes drifting in thin air. But the Americans did not break. P-51 slashed through the interceptors, diving and climbing with vicious precision. Luftwaffe pilots who had once hunted unescorted bombers now found themselves hunted. Unteroffizier Karl Dietrich, flying his Messerschmitt, later recalled the shock. They were everywhere. Mustangs above Berlin, it meant the end. The losses were savage. 69 American bombers went down that day, along with 11 escorts. Hundreds of airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. It was the costliest raid yet for the 8th Air Force, but Berlin had been hit, its factories, rail yards, and morale shaken. The Luftwaffe lost 64 fighters, irreplaceable machines flown by veterans who could not be trained again quickly with fuel supplies dwindling. For Germany, the exchange was unsustainable. For America, the losses, though grievous, could be replenished in days. McCloskey and his surviving crew landed back in England after 11 hours in the air, their fortress scarred and leaking hydraulic fluid. Ground crews counted more than 100 holes in the fuselage. Yet the engines had held, the crew had lived, and Berlin had been bombed in daylight. In the debriefing tent, exhausted men slumped over coffee mugs, some too numb to speak. Hell of a Monday, one muttered. The name stuck, Black Monday. The Germans had laughed at the idea of American bombers reaching Berlin. That morning, the laughter ended. Berliners had woken to daylight air raid sirens, not Meyer's trumpets of mockery, but the thunder of industrial democracy delivered on wings. The Reich had discovered that American bombers could not only reach Berlin, they could return. And tomorrow, there would be more. Albert Speer spread the reports across his desk, the paper edges curling under the heat of the desk lamp. It was May 1944, and the numbers were stark. Aviation fuel production, once at 175,000 tons per month, had fallen to 30,000. By September, it would collapse further, to barely 5,000. Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments, prided himself on efficiency and rational calculation. He could see what others refused to say aloud. The Luftwaffe, once the sharp sword of the Reich, was being strangled at its source. The shift had begun with precision. In February, during Big Week, American bombers tore into aircraft factories across Germany. Now the Allies had turned to synthetic oil plants, the lifeblood of the Luftwaffe. Leuna, Pulitz, Merseburg, facilities that had once churned out the gasoline to fuel Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs now burned under waves of flying fortresses. Bombing oil meant more than destroying fuel tanks. It meant grounding squadrons, shortening training hours, condemning aircraft to sit idle. For Unteroffizier Karl Dietrich, a young fighter pilot of Jägerschwader 11, the change was immediate. He remembered the spring when sorties grew fewer, when training flights were cut short after only minutes in the air. Some days, his Bf-109 sat untouched on the tarmac while he was ordered to conserve fuel. When combat missions came, they were rushed, poorly coordinated, and deadly. The Americans had Mustangs now, ranging everywhere. "We flew with empty stomachs and half-empty tanks," he later recalled. "We were not beaten in the air. We were beaten on the ground, by numbers, by fuel, by machines." The arithmetic was unforgiving. The United States built more than 300,000 aircraft during the war. Germany could not match even a fraction, and now, even when fighters rolled off assembly lines, they had no gasoline to fly. Pilot training hours fell from over 200 in 1940 to fewer than 50 by late 1944. Inexperienced boys went aloft against swarms of Mustangs and Fortresses, many not surviving their first missions. The Luftwaffe's ace pilots, veterans of Spain and the Blitz, were dying faster than they could be replaced. Speer saw the writing on the wall. He later admitted at Nuremberg, with cold clarity, that once the Allies began bombing oil, the war was lost. The Reich had built its military machine on the assumption of secure resources. Now, in his ledgers, he watched those assumptions collapse into scarcity. On the American side, the scale of abundance defied comprehension. Willow Run continued to roll a new B-24 off the line every hour. Pratt & Whitney delivered engines by the tens of thousands. Petroleum from Texas and California flowed freely, refined into high-octane aviation fuel that filled endless steel drums. Allied bombers consumed more gasoline in a single raid than some German squadrons received in a month. The imbalance was not measured in dozens, but in orders of magnitude. For German civilians, the effects appeared in subtle miseries. Streetcars stopped running for lack of coal. Food shipments faltered because railways lacked fuel. Soldiers on leave discovered there were no trains to take them home. Anna Weber saw it in her hospital. Supplies dwindled, blackouts lengthened, and patients whispered of shortages everywhere. The city had burned in November, but by the summer of 1944, Berlin was suffocating in scarcity. Speer pressed his pen against the report, calculating margins, seeking miracles in numbers that offered none. He knew he was watching the Luftwaffe bleed out without ever taking off. Fuel was the oxygen of war, and now the Allies had their hands on the Reich's throat. By autumn, Allied pilots would note with surprise the thinning opposition. Where once hundreds of interceptors rose, now only scattered handfuls dared attack. The Luftwaffe had not surrendered. It had simply run dry. 2 days after the shock of 6 March 1944, the engines roared again over East Anglia. The crews of the 8th Air Force strapped themselves in with the same ritual. Oxygen masks checked, interphones tested, gloves pulled tight against the thin cold of altitude. Orders were simple: return to Berlin. This time, 623 bombers assembled in disciplined formation, bristling with machine guns, each one heavy with destruction. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Karl Dietrich, strapped into his Bf 109, heard his commander's clipped order over the radio. Angriff, attack. Fuel gauges were low, always low, but the Reich needed every fighter in the air. As the bomber stream appeared, stretching like a silver river across the sky, he felt the same disbelief he had on the 6th of March. How can they send so many, so soon? The fight was brutal. 37 American bombers were lost, along with 18 escorts. German pilots claimed kills with bursts of 20mm fire, watching fortresses peel away trailing smoke. Yet for every bomber that fell, another closed the gap, the stream unbroken. 42 Luftwaffe fighters were destroyed that day, many with their experienced pilots. The exchange ratio spoke volumes. America could afford its losses. Germany could not. For Captain James "Red" McCloskey, flying again after surviving Black Monday, the arithmetic was clear. "We lose ships every raid," he would have written home, "but the line never breaks. We come back and find new crews waiting, new forts parked on the strip, ready to go." At debriefings, the names of missing friends were read in somber tones. Yet by morning, fresh aircraft filled the gaps. American industry ensured there was always another bomber, another pilot, another mission. The numbers defied belief. By 1944, the United States was producing over 8,000 aircraft every month, more than Germany could build in an entire year of war. Willow Run alone produced 428 Liberators in August, a single month's output greater than the Luftwaffe's total serviceable strength on some fronts. A single factory in Michigan outbuilt a military machine that had conquered Europe. On the German side, scarcity became suffocation. Fuel rations cut training flights to minutes. Replacement pilots went into combat half-prepared, facing veterans from Iowa or Ohio who had already flown a dozen missions. Dietrich saw boys younger than himself take to the air with barely 50 hours of flying time, only to vanish in smoke within days. The Luftwaffe still fought with ferocity, but its edge dulled with every sortie. Berliners, too, recognized the shift. Anna Weber walked streets where tram lines no longer ran and coal deliveries failed. After the March raids, families crowded into shelters, no longer laughing at sirens. Rumors spread of American factories producing bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. "They waste machines," one old man whispered, "but they have more." For civilians, the raids revealed the impossible truth. American abundance made destruction inexhaustible. For the Americans, the loss of 37 bombers in one day was a tragedy. For Germany, the loss of 42 fighters was a catastrophe. The Luftwaffe's pilots were skilled, disciplined, brave, but each one lost meant months of training erased, experience gone forever. The Reich system could not replace them. As the surviving bombers landed back in England, ground crews patched holes, replaced engines, and readied them for the next raid. Men mourned their friends quietly, then climbed back aboard for missions still to come. To them, the war was measured in hours of oxygen hiss, flak bursts, and engines straining. To historians, it is measured in production numbers, numbers that tell why the Luftwaffe never recovered. The Americans had shown that they could return to Berlin days after the bloodiest mission in their history. The Reich had no answer. Abundance itself had become the deadliest weapon. The night shift at Willow Run began with the blast of a whistle. In the cavernous plant, floodlights bathed the line in white glare, casting long shadows over steel frames and aluminum skins. Rivet guns cracked in rapid rhythm, echoing like a distant battlefield. Women in kerchiefs leaned into their work, their hands calloused from hours of drilling and fastening. Men in coveralls wheeled crates of parts down the aisles, dodging forklifts as if in a dance. From above, the scene looked less like a factory than a living organism. An industrial symphony with each worker a note in a score that spanned the continent. At the far end of the mile-long line, a B-24 Liberator stood completed. Its twin tail fins rose like cathedral spires under the lamps, the insignia of a white star in a blue circle freshly painted on its fuselage. Inspectors ran their hands along the aluminum skin, signing off with grease-penciled initials. Soon the bomber would join thousands of others rolling off lines in Michigan, Texas, California, and beyond. This was democracy's weapon, not just the machine, but the ability to build them endlessly. America launched 2,710 Liberty ships during the war. Cargo vessels produced so quickly that one shipyard set a record of completing one in just 4 days. Hershey's factories in Pennsylvania produced 24 million chocolate bars each week, packed into bomber rations. Steel, poured out of Pittsburgh mills by the millions of tons, rolled into armor plate, artillery barrels, and aircraft frames. The numbers seemed unreal, yet each was tallied, shipped, and used. Compared to the Reich's artisanal production, the contrast was staggering. German aircraft factories turned out machines slowly, relying on craftsmen and scarce materials. The Allies destroyed them faster than they could be repaired. In America, assembly lines replaced artistry with repetition, efficiency, and scale. A single week of American aircraft production could equal or surpass an entire month of German output. The Germans scoffed at this as wasteful. They failed to see that waste was itself a weapon. When you can afford to lose 30 bombers and replace them immediately, attrition becomes strategy. For the workers, the war felt both distant and immediate. Letters from sons overseas were pinned above workbenches. Radio news crackled with reports of battles in Italy and the Pacific. At lunch breaks, men and women ate sandwiches beside fuselages, their talk a mixture of production quotas and rumors from the front. Each rivet hammered, each engine tested, was a tangible contribution. Unlike in Germany, where forced laborers toiled under compulsion, America's workers labored for overtime pay, union benefits, and above all, belief in the cause. The abundance filtered directly to the front. When Captain James Red McCloskey climbed into his B-17 for yet another mission, he knew that behind him stretched a supply chain thousands of miles long. Spare engines arrived before old ones failed. Ammunition belts were always full. Even small comforts, a Hershey bar tucked into a flight jacket, a fresh pair of gloves, reminded airmen that their nation stood behind them. For men like Carl Dietrich, rationing meant empty tanks and worn boots. For men like McCloskey, abundance meant readiness. Anna Weber, tending the wounded in Berlin, heard the difference secondhand. Prisoners of war whispered of American ships unloading in endless streams at English docks. Civilians in her city bartered stale bread while she read pamphlets dropped from the skies describing American factories producing more planes in a month than Germany in a year. She wanted to dismiss them as propaganda, but she could see the truth etched into the wounds of her patients. Airstrikes growing larger, more frequent, more destructive. At Willow Run, another bomber rolled off the line. A foreman glanced at his watch. 63 minutes, right on schedule. He wiped his brow and gestured the line forward. Behind him, thousands of workers moved and practiced rhythm, the industrial symphony never stopping. The shriek of steel on steel once defined Berlin's rhythm. Trains rumbled through Anhalter Bahnhof, carrying coal from Silesia, grain from East Prussia, and soldiers bound for the front. The lifelines of the Reich pulsed through the city's arteries, rail yards marshalling depots, junctions where iron threads converged. By 1944, those threads began to snap under the weight of American bombing. On the morning of 21st June, the sky above Berlin filled with the drone of engines. Hundreds of B-17, escorted by swarms of P-51s, swept toward the marshalling yards. Bomb bay doors groaned open, and sticks of 500-pound bombs cascaded downward, their fins whistling in deadly unison. Explosions rolled across the city like thunderclaps. Tracks twisted into blackened ribbons, locomotives toppled on their sides, freight cars splintered into heaps of smoking timber. The yards that once handled thousands of tons of supplies daily were paralyzed in hours. Anna Weber, emerging from her hospital shift, saw the aftermath. Tram lines sat frozen, their electric cables dangling like torn cobwebs. Families who once relied on trains for evacuation found stations gutted, glass crunching underfoot. It felt, she later recalled, as if the city's heartbeat had stopped. Supplies meant for civilians, coal, flour, potatoes, never arrived. Hospitals waited for medicines that never came. Berlin, still swelling with refugees from the east, was left choking on its own isolation. The numbers told the larger truth. In the last half of 1944 alone, the Allies dropped 481,000 tons of bombs on Germany, more than had fallen in all of 1943. A single raid on Berlin's rail network consumed more explosives than the Luftwaffe could deliver against London in an entire month of the Blitz. The imbalance was no longer measured in battles won or lost, but in supply lines erased. For Luftwaffe pilots like Carl Dietrich, the paralysis was palpable. His airfield once received steady shipments of aviation fuel by rail. Now deliveries dwindled to a trickle, convoys delayed or destroyed. On days when orders came to scramble, ground crews siphoned gasoline from training aircraft just to fuel a handful of operational fighters. "We were like birds with clipped wings," Dietrich later wrote. "We sat on the runway watching the contrails overhead, unable to climb into the fight." The raids grew systematic. Transportation hubs in Leipzig, Dresden, and Hamburg followed, but Berlin remained the prime target. The Americans called it chopping the Reich's spine. Without trains, German armies in the east starved for supplies. Factories in the west could not ship goods to the front. Even civilian life crumbled. Coal shortages plunged apartments into freezing darkness. Food queues lengthened until they disappeared altogether. By late 1944, Berliners whispered of famine more than of bombs. For American crews, the scale of destruction was measured in instruments and photographs. McCloskey's crew returned from one raid with bomb cameras showing yards engulfed in black smoke, hundreds of wagons overturned. At debriefing, intelligence officers explained what those photographs meant. Every rail yard destroyed delayed thousands of troops, silenced artillery batteries, starved factories. The airmen understood then that their bombs did more than shatter buildings. They severed the Reich's nerves. Anna saw the consequences firsthand. Patients arrived malnourished, shivering in thin coats. Children fainted from hunger. Old women carried coal dust in jars, scavenged from wreckage, to heat one room for an hour. She no longer needed propaganda leaflets to tell her what American abundance meant. She lived its opposite every day. By early 1945, Berlin was a fortress without arteries. The guns still roared. The flak towers still spat fire. But trains no longer arrived. The city of millions was left to burn and starve, waiting for the armies that closed from east and west. Dawn broke gray over East Anglia, the mist clinging low to the airfields. Crews of the 8th Air Force walked across frozen ground, their breath fogging before them, boots crunching on frost. Captain James Red McCloskey glanced at the operations board, reading the word that sent a chill through every veteran flyer: Berlin. The capital was the target again, but this time on a scale no one had seen before. At briefing, the commander pointed to the map strung across the wall. Arrows traced from England over the North Sea, converging on Germany's scarred heart. "Gentlemen," he said, voice steady, "this will be the largest strike yet. 1,400 bombers, nearly 1,000 fighters. Objective: government quarter and rail hubs. Berlin must not function as a capital any longer." The room was silent, save for the rustle of paper and the scratch of pencils. The men knew what awaited them: flak towers, desperate fighters, and hours of bitter cold. Still, they strapped in, each man checking his station, each machine bristling with guns. By mid-morning, the armada filled the sky. Waves of B-17 and B-24s stretched horizon to horizon, silver wings catching the pale sunlight. Above and around, squadrons of P-51 Mustangs circled, sleek shadows guarding the stream. It was a sight Göring himself would later admit sealed his despair. Daylight bombers over Berlin, escorted every mile by fighters. The city was already weakened from months of pounding, its rail system crippled, its factories broken. But 3rd February was something else entirely. At 11 a.m., the first formations reached the city, bomb bay doors opened, and the sound of the wind rushing into the fuselage drowned out even the engines. Then came the release. Sticks of 500 and 1,000-pound bombs tumbling in endless succession. The shock waves rolled through Berlin like earthquakes, glass exploding outward, stone facades collapsing. Anna Weber huddled in a basement with her patients, listening to the roar above. Each detonation shook plaster from the ceiling, dust filling their lungs. When she ventured out hours later, the government quarter lay in ruins. The Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrecht Street was gutted. The city's telephone exchange was smashed. Railway junctions were twisted into wreckage. Fires raged in Moabit and Mita. The statistics were staggering. More than 1,000 B-17 and B-24s dropped over 2,500 tons of explosives on Berlin that day. Casualties reached 2,500 dead, with 100,000 left homeless in a single raid. For comparison, the Luftwaffe's heaviest raids on London in 1940 had rarely inflicted more than 1,000 casualties in one night. Now, in just a few hours of daylight, America had unleashed devastation on a scale Germany could never equal. The Luftwaffe's resistance was token. A handful of fighters rose, but most lacked fuel to intercept effectively. Flak guns still roared, punching holes in the formations, but the stream held steady. American losses were painful. Dozens of bombers fell, but replacements would be waiting on the tarmac by week's end. The Reich had no such luxury. From his cockpit, McCloskey looked down on the inferno. Smoke boiled upward in thick columns, rising to meet his formation at 20,000 feet. He had seen cities burn before, but Berlin was different. This was the Reich's heart, once untouchable, now torn open by waves of industrial power. He glanced at the bomb bay, empty now, and whispered to himself, "This is the end of them." For Berlin's people, the day marked a breaking point. Anna saw families wandering the streets in shock, their belongings clutched in bundles, their homes gone. Children cried for parents who did not emerge from shelters. The hospitals overflowed with wounded, and even Anna's steady hands trembled as she bandaged burns and broken bones. By evening, the Armada was gone, droning back across the North Sea. Berlin smoldered behind them, a wounded city staggering under a blow that revealed what American abundance truly meant. The Reich could still command, still order, still march, but its capital was burning in broad daylight. The Reichsmarschall stood on the balcony of his Karen Hall estate, staring toward the eastern sky. It was late February, 1945, and the air carried the dull thunder of engines even before the formations appeared. At first they looked like faint scratches against the blue. Then the contrails thickened into great white rivers flowing west to east. Among them darted smaller streaks, fast and agile. Goring lowered his binoculars, his face pale. "They are Mustangs," he muttered to his adjutant. "If they can fly here, to Berlin, and back to England, then we have lost the war." The sight was unthinkable just a few years earlier. The Luftwaffe had once ruled the skies of Europe, its pilots feared from Warsaw to Paris. Now Goering, the man who had promised Germany that no bomber would touch the Ruhr, watched as enemy fighters patrolled over the Reich's capital in broad daylight. The arrogance of 1939 had curdled into despair. The nickname Meyer was no longer a joke, but a curse whispered by Berliners as their city burned. The P-51 Mustang had changed everything. With drop tanks slung under its wings, it could escort bombers 1,600 miles round trip. Armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns and capable of over 430 miles per hour, it could climb with the Messerschmitt and dive with the Focke-Wulf. The Luftwaffe had no answer. Germany's finest aces fell one by one, their replacements barely trained. By 1945, many new pilots entered combat with fewer than 50 flying hours. Against seasoned American flyers, they were slaughtered. Karl Dietrich saw the shift firsthand. Once, he had risen with dozens of comrades to intercept bomber streams. Now only a handful of aircraft stood ready on his airfield, many grounded for lack of fuel. On the day he first saw Mustangs circling over Berlin, he felt a pit in his stomach. We could not climb without fuel. We could not fight without numbers. And yet above us, the sky was full of enemies. He strapped into his Bf-109 and taxied, only to be waved down by his commander. Fuel had to be saved for emergencies. He watched the contrails drift overhead, powerless. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. Between January and April 1945, the Luftwaffe lost more than 3,000 fighters in combat. American bomber losses in that same period, though still heavy, were replenished almost instantly. Germany had no aviation fuel, no trained pilots, and dwindling aircraft. The Reich's proud air arm had withered into a shell of scattered squadrons. For Berlin's civilians, the silence of German fighters was deafening. Anna Weber noticed it during raids. Fewer machine gun duels in the skies, less tracer fire arcing upward. The flak tower still boomed, but she realized the air defense was thinning. "We used to believe our fighters were angels above us," she later remembered. By 1945, we looked up and saw only enemies. Goring himself admitted the truth to colleagues in private, though never in public. The Reich had been outbuilt, outproduced, and outflown. He had once promised no enemy plane would touch the Ruhr. Now fleets of bombers and Mustangs filled Berlin's skies daily. His laughter in 1939 had become a bitter silence. His confidence turned into disbelief at the scale of American abundance. On that balcony, as contrails stretched across the horizon, Göring finally saw the impossible realized. The industrial democracy he had mocked had overwhelmed his air force not with brilliance of design alone, but with sheer arithmetic. More bombers, more fighters, more fuel, more men. The Luftwaffe, once Germany's pride, was finished. The war's end was not marked by a single explosion, but by a reckoning written in numbers. In April 1945, Berlin lay in ruins, its streets clogged with rubble, its civilians starving, its government issuing orders no one could carry out. The Red Army pressed from the east, the Americans from the west, but the capital had already been mortally wounded by an invisible force: production. Consider the arithmetic. The Allies dropped 2.77 million tons of bombs on Europe, of which more than 1.5 million came from the United States Army Air Forces alone. Germany had no defense against that scale. In 1944, American factories turned out 96,000 aircraft. The Reich, struggling under scarcity, produced barely a fraction of that. By the war's end, the United States had built more than 300,000 planes, an arsenal so vast that in some months, American industry produced more aircraft than the entire Luftwaffe had in its inventory. Albert Speer, reviewing his ledgers at Nuremberg, admitted what Göring never would. Once the Allies began systematically bombing oil, he said, the war was lost. His confession was more than personal guilt. It was a recognition that the Reich had been defeated not only on the battlefield, but in the factory and the supply line. Without fuel, without rail, without production, even the most disciplined army crumbled. For Captain James "Red" McCloskey, the war's conclusion felt less like triumph than survival. He walked among the skeletons of his bomb group, empty bunks, names crossed off rosters, and marveled that he had flown 25 missions over Germany and lived. Each raid had seemed like an individual gamble. Only later did he understand that his survival had been secured not just by courage, but by mathematics, the endless supply of aircraft, ammunition, and fuel his nation delivered. He had been one man, but behind him stood the forges of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of California, the cornfields turned into factories in Michigan. For Anna Weber, wandering through Berlin's ruins, the legacy was more immediate. She passed gutted streets, rail lines severed, hospitals overflowing. She heard stories of Americans who dropped not just bombs, but food parcels, of chocolate bars tossed to children across wire fences. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The Reich had ruled through fear and scarcity. America fought with abundance and then with generosity. The impossible statistics carried moral weight. A single American factory, Willow Run, produced more bombers than Germany's entire industry in some years. Liberty ships slid into the Atlantic faster than U-boats could sink them, nearly 2,800 in total. Hershey's produced billions of chocolate bars, each wrapped in foil and tucked into rations that sustained soldiers across continents. These details were not trivial. They revealed a democracy's strength, a nation that could outproduce its enemies not just in weapons, but in comforts. The irony lingered. Göring had promised that no bomber would ever reach the Ruhr, and if one did, Germans could call him Meyer. By 1945, not only had bombers reached the Ruhr, they had burned Berlin to its foundations, shielded by Mustangs that flew unchallenged over the Reich. His boast had become his epitaph. History remembers battles, generals, and speeches. Yet the true story of Berlin's burning lies in ledgers and assembly lines. America did not win by tradition or by heritage. It won by turning freedom into steel, by transforming farms and factories into the greatest arsenal the world had ever seen. In doing so, it proved that democracy, messy, improvised, abundant, was mightier than tyranny drilled into rigid perfection. As Berlin smoldered and Europe staggered toward peace, the lesson was clear. Courage had carried the bombers into the sky, but arithmetic had carried them to victory. The laughter of 1939 had been answered by fire in 1945. And in that final balance sheet, freedom's abundance had burned away the illusions of tyranny, leaving only ashes where arrogance once stood.